All right, everybody. I have Antony Davies and James Harrigan on today. The two all-stars. We're blessed. That's all I can say. So I actually grabbed both guys who are two popular guests on my podcast, and we're going to see if we can explode the internet or do something good here by having them both on at the same time. And I'll relay a story that I just told each of them individually, which was that I just got off the phone with a client not too long ago. And she said, "Oh, I just got done listening to the Words and Numbers guys, the podcast you did with each of them for the second time. I love those guys." I said, "Well, I'm going to be doing one with both of them." So I hope you're as psyched as I am to have both of them on. Antony and James do a podcast called Words and Numbers every week, right, guys?
Every week.
That's right. Yep. And let's see what else. Oh, so Ant's a professor at Duquesne, and James, Mr. Faculty member of U of Arizona. And what else do you guys want to say before we just rock and roll and do our heavy lifting?
Well, as long as you mention our podcast, if anyone's interested, they can find us at wordsandnumbers.org.
That's great. That's great. And we'll make sure we'll do plugs at the end as well. And let me know if you want anything. What's the best way to get in touch with you guys besides Twitter, okay? All right, man. We are tasked with reconstructing America. One of us, it's going to be great. So, we've got our three branches and all that stuff, but we actually are kind of in charge. We're gonna set things right, and then we have good men and good women in power, recognizing that very limited government is probably helpful, but not total anarchy. I don't think we're there quite yet. Where do we begin? I've got my sense. You got to start with people. You got to start with people having a freedom consciousness and all that. So we'll get to my side of that in a little bit, but we've got economist, political scientist, and I don't know what you call me, but where do we start, guys?
Well, you've already made a mistake. When you said, no, you really haven't. You've made a very common mistake. It's a mistake that almost everyone makes when they think about politics. And
yep.
You said a moment ago that there are good people working in government. And that's actually an error, because the people you find working in government are exactly the same people you find not working in government. They're subject to all the same forces and pressures that all the rest of us are. And James Madison, back in 1787 in the Federalist, wrote that enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm. And the trick is to devise a governing system that will take that as a given, not one that will find good people as a given, because you're just not that likely to find good people. Now, you will from time to time, right? Every now and then, the right guy at the right time finds his way into the right office, and the mountain people sing songs about him for hundreds of years afterwards. But as these things go, what you're likely to find is pretty regular people trying to do whatever they can do, given the various constraints they face. So the trick first is to understand that. And once you understand that, it becomes much more evident the kind of constraints you need to build into the system. And Madison followed up his statement on human nature by saying parchment barriers will never be enough, right? Mm-hmm. Not enough to just have a constitution and write these things down. If that were enough, every constitution would work. So what you have to do, says Madison, and I tend to agree, I've never heard a better argument than his, is arrange power in such a way that ambition counteracts ambition, right? One of the famous things that Madison says in the Federalist. And to the degree that we managed that, we did pretty well as a country. But there were a couple of things that couldn't have been foreseen in 1787. The guys who framed the Constitution were firmly of a mind that if you're going to have a problem in a representative republic, it's going to be the legislative branch, right? Just as if you're going to have a problem in a constitutional monarchy, it's the executive branch that will cause you the trouble. It's wherever that real power lies, that's where problems are going to come. And they put a lot of restrictions on Congress as a result of this thought, maybe too many, because by the time we get to the 20th century, you see the executive branch doing laps around the legislative branch, becoming more powerful. Well, okay, there's probably problem number one. Problem number two.
Before you go any further, I got to unpack that. So, yes, you need. Let's at least start with some parchment, which recognizes that governments cannot do whatever they want. I've been a big fan of, I've been reading the law a couple times in the last couple months here, which Bastiat obviously talks about. The proper use of force is only an extension of what my individual right of force. It's the government's use of force is only the collective right of self-defense. But once it starts being used to what he refers to as plunder, to profit this person and give to that, here we are with the executive or whoever wants to making law and taking from one and giving to another, slavery, on and on. I guess I just wanted to circle back to the idea is, and here's my train going by. One, we need a very limited government that only grants certain authority. Well, two trains are going and they're beeping to each other, I guess. A limited government where they can only do certain things. And you mentioned ambition battles ambition. So it's intended to have some gridlock here, right?
Yeah, that was the design feature. That's not a bug. It's not a flaw. It's a feature. The American government was designed to be very inefficient.
Excellent. Okay, one more thing, and then I'm going to tag our boy Ant in, and we're going to get to number two. And then the thing that I would cycle back around to is, again and again, a moral and awake population that understands the principles of freedom. Otherwise, they'll start doing what would happen to us anyway, which is start to demand to use force for our own personal gain. Right.
Yeah, and I'm going to shelve that one for now because I sense we're going to get back to it in a meaningful way as the conversation unravels the way I think it will. So I want to get to number two and then throw it over to Ant because between that and the human nature argument, it dovetails into something he's been studying for quite some time. But the second thing, and I think it flows out of the batch of concerns that arise when you talk about the things you were just talking about, Ron. The second thing is the ability of the government to spend more than it has, which year over year is what we call the deficit. The deficit year over year adds up to a debt. And right now, I think we talked about this last time I was on, we have a $21 trillion stated debt. You throw in unfunded mandates and liabilities, and you're probably up, look at the delta here, between 120 trillion and 220 trillion. That's as close as we can get to estimating it. So fabulous is it? So we've got a couple of big picture problems, and I think they all reduce to a human nature problem. And human nature is the greatest government is the greatest reflection on human nature, if we're going to stop with Madison yet again. So Ant studies what's called public choice economics, which takes all of this into account in a way that other subfields in economics don't. So maybe you can add something now.
Well, the fun part about public choice economics is it takes what we understand about how humans behave in the private sector and applies that knowledge to humans who behave in the public sector. So, when I talk to people about this, my warning is that our knee-jerk reaction is to treat government as a magic wand. You say, well, just pass this law to fix this problem. And what we imagine happens when we pass this law is it violates virtually everything that economists understand about how humans behave. So public choice economics is about taking a very realistic look at what happens when you say to the government, do something.
And in a lot of ways, it's really a footnote to Madison. Right? Madison was onto these things in 1787, and then public choice economics comes and really fleshes them out more deeply and studies the individual behaviors and pathologies that emerge when you start putting people in control of things.
We all learn about the checks and balances that were built into the system here. You learn this in high school when you study civics, and I think the founders paid some close attention to these political constraints of building in the checks and balances. And what they missed, and perhaps we can't fault them for missing it given their times, they missed the economic checks and balances, the economic constraints. And I think we're missing two important constraints that if the founders had to do it over again, knowing what we know, they would think about building these in. And one is a flat tax, because with a progressive tax like we have in this system, it becomes far too easy for a majority of Americans to end up being net recipients while a minority of Americans end up paying. And so when you combine this phenomenon that arises from a progressive tax with a democratic system, all of a sudden you're in a situation where the majority can vote themselves ever larger and larger paychecks at the expense of a minority. Yep. So that's one. A flat tax would help fix that check in place. Another check that we're missing is, and James alluded to this earlier, is a balanced budget. We talk a lot about how much the federal government has borrowed, and we see all these big numbers. And I think what people miss is that government borrowing is just like that progressive tax. It's taking from one group of people and giving to another. In this case, it's even more insidious, because what we're doing is taking from a group of people who can't vote to counteract our political power. And that's future generations. They haven't been born yet. But that's what government borrowing is. It's spending money on us today at the expense of generations who will come in the future. So I think those two important checks and balances should have been built into the system as economic constraints from the beginning.
I would submit that the income tax actually was, because an income tax was unconstitutional till the 16th Amendment in 1913.
Right, that's a good point. Yeah.
I don't think they could have seen the absolute foolishness that has come with the United States tax code, but they were on top of the idea more generally. But, you know, there has to be an amendment process in any constitution. Nothing can remain static in perpetuity. And there it is, right? By the time we get to the progressive era in this country, the early part of the 20th century, it was, I think, a foregone conclusion that was going to change. And it did in 1913.
This is good. I want to keep going here as we're taking this apart, because if we're going to put something in its place or rip out some of the fat that's kind of collected on the Constitution or on limited government, it's good to name some of the problems, right? So, you know, we've got the misses with economics. We've got, you know, the conversion of America from, I guess a limited constitutional republic to more and more a democracy, and more where people expect that I can vote myself something and not even consider where it came from. So what are some other problems that we would need to rectify?
I think we've got a good start, right? The two things that Ant mentions as economic concerns are, I think, exactly the two that you'd need to start with, right? On the one hand, doing with progressive taxation, at least in large part, and then number two, addressing the idea of endless deficit spending. Right? These are real problems. If you take a step backward from there and say, okay, it's maybe a more interesting question, what did they get right? And I think they got a couple of things right. Separation of powers is, I think, a brilliant principle, especially when you consider it in the light of federalism. So you get both a vertical and a horizontal separation of powers. And the more you can keep those branches and those levels of government from cooperating, the better off you are. So as government has become more cooperative from the 20th century forward, and you see things like the legislative and executive branches crawling into bed together, the federal government and the state governments crawling into bed together, that's really where the problems come. When government is empowered to do things, you get all kinds of trouble. When it's very, very difficult for government to get things done, you find that things get prioritized, and the things that need to get done, and people's pet projects drift to the side.
It sounds like almost like competition in that regard.
Exactly so. Exactly so. And it's a very common sense way of looking at the world. And, you know, typically people have a knee-jerk reaction, and they think that government should run very smoothly, very efficiently, and be very powerful. But when people say that to me, I just have a very simple question I like to throw at them. Give me examples of powerful governments with central control that did only good things for their citizens. And it's very, very difficult to come up with a list of those countries. And then I say, well, okay, give me a list of governments that fit these criteria who did quite horrible things to their citizens. And then the list is very long. And people tend to start rethinking things when they think about them in those terms, although it's rather difficult to get them to think about things in those terms when typically they're motivated by the question, what can government do for me? Instead of what will government do to me?
Okay, so Ann, I want to ask you about public choice economics, and I wanted to make a quick point. So let me just touch, and then hand it over to you, because that brings me back to my big bit, which is always the morality question. And actually, James, I think if you turn the volume down on your thing, that'll have me reverb a little bit less, if that's an option, because I'm hearing my reverb a bunch. So the morality is. We got to start with first things. There is a reality. There are truths to be known and principles to be lived by. Okay, we need to go into much detail with that. But amongst these things are, I think each of us talked about this in our individual podcasts. I own me, so I get to smoke marijuana if I want. Like, no one can force me or coerce me to stop from smoking marijuana if I'd like to, or drinking poison from underneath this kitchen sink if I'd like to. This is my body. If I want to walk across the room, no one can physically stop me. No one has a right to operate my body. And I've got a right to use my hands and my wisdom and my collected skills and my intuitions to take a tree that I just felled and craft it into a chair. I get to do that and then sell it. That is my labor. That is my life, my liberty, my property. Who can make a better claim on my property, which is the manifestation of my life, my time? And if you claim that you own 13% of it, then I'm a 13% slave. And so what I think is, I look at rebuilding our society. I want to acknowledge, and maybe I have no business doing this to the other 330 million people, but unless you want a complete anarchy, which I don't think that ultimately is going to work, though there are some brilliant anarchists out there who contribute to the freedom conversation quite, heftily. I think we need to get really clear that, hey, government, or hey, population, you own yourself. You have liberty. You own your property. And for us to do these very limited things, which, James, we're going to talk about in a moment, or Ant, we need to tax you this little bit so we can protect you from Russia coming over, or whomever coming over, whatever the basics are, the collective right of self-defense, and a couple things. We'll give them post offices too if we have to, but very limited. So as I look at that, and now I look at the economics, Ant, public choice economics, how does what I just rambled on about fit into an economic institution, if I can even call it that? Maybe I shouldn't even be saying that, because it means it's a formalized something. How does that fit into our economic system that we create?
Yeah, so I think the place to start is with the principle that a proper government is one that prevents people from harming each other,
right,
and otherwise leaves them alone. So issues about whether I can smoke marijuana or not, that has nothing to do with harming anyone else, so it should clearly be off the table.
Right.
Now, polluting the atmosphere, rivers, lakes, this kind of thing, that's imposing harm on someone. So clearly this is a place for government. Now, once you've determined, we've identified some place for government here, the next step, I think, is figuring out what it is we should do. And our knee-jerk reaction is to go 100% government and say, okay, we need to pass laws to fix this thing. I think a better approach is to think of how government and markets can work together. And a good example of this is how we handle carbon emissions. And what happens is the EPA says, okay, we're going to allow a certain amount of carbon emissions, and they will issue credits. And if you have, with the credits, you can emit a certain amount of carbon. And the fun part is the credits are transferable. So if I've got an old style factory that emits a lot of carbon, you've invested a lot of your money into a brand new one that emits little, I can purchase from you your carbon credits. So now I have enough credits to produce the amount of pollution I'm doing. And what happens here? Well, what happens is a market develops for those credits. And the price of the credits will naturally move to give me, the guy with the old factory, a profit incentive to pollute as little as I can, and to invest money to do what you do, and invest money in a better quality factory that pollutes less. And what you've got there is a nice version of the government not telling you how to go about doing something, but rather setting up the incentives. and letting the market figure out how to go about doing this thing.
Here's my concern, though, and yeah, please allay my concern is, oh, there's global warming. Got to do something right now. Yeah, but it's cooler than it's been in, like 40, springs in America. Global warming, shut up. Like, it's climate change. Just stay focused. We need carbon credits for everybody. And now you can see the government creating its own monstrosity and it creating a thing. So even though you were using that as an example, that to me is like, uh-oh. My concern is there's an entry point for governments to begin to say, we've also got this problem over here and this problem over here, and we need to give credits for that. And now you got to earn credits, and that scares me.
Yeah, there's no perfect answer to this, right? The best we can do is find better answers and worse answers. And a better answer is employing co-opting the marketplace. I'll give you another example to move away from air pollution, because even in a straight up market environment, air pollution is a hard thing to deal with. There was a group of people got together and formed what they called the Ansari X Prize. And this was a bunch of wealthy people put down a bunch of money. I think it was $10 million. And they said, this prize goes to the first person who can build a spacecraft, take it into orbit, come back down, repeat the process within 2 weeks. You do that, you get the prize. Now stop and think about that for a moment. If the government had done our moon landing that way, how different things would have been. It would not be the government building NASA, which is then this thing that requires continual funding and it's subject to political pressures and all of that. Rather, the government would put on the table a bunch of money, pick a number, $10 billion. This goes to the first person who can send a human being to the moon, bring him back alive. So what the government's done there is defined the outcome. This is what we want. And you leave it to the market to figure out how to do that. And one of the upsides of this is, if it's not possible, the government's not out the money. The prize only goes to the person who succeeds. And you balance that against what's the probability of success. I'm an entrepreneur. I want to try this out. I'm going to convince other people to invest and help me make this work. And what's the payoff? Well, the payoff is that $10 billion. And to the extent that reasonable people think this is a risk worth taking, they'll invest in it. To the extent they don't, they won't. And again, you have the market making a decision as to whether or not this is a good idea in the first place.
That makes sense.
Ant said something a few minutes ago that bears repeating. He said that this is about better and worse. And that's exactly correct. More often than not, when we talk about political things and philosophical things, we talk about perfect and pointless, right? But that's never the issue. Better and worse is the issue. And we can almost always do better. We can almost never be perfect, right? So we end up letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? To use a common phrase. And it does us well not to think of things in those terms, right? You can conceive of things in those terms all you want, but when we have the argument, it's really about better and worse. And every political thing aims at something better. Right? That's the very point of engaging in a political discussion. I've got an idea, it will be better than what we now have. And we think that the ideas that we've got, that basket of ideas that we typically work with, if everybody worked from them, we would be far, far better off. Would things be perfect? Absolutely not. They would not be. There would be all kinds of problems that would emerge, things that we can't even foresee at this point. Right? Because no one's omniscient. If you do something, all kinds of unintended consequences are going to emerge. And we cheerfully admit this. What we say is what we've got here is a far better set of operating instructions. And that should be enough to get started. All right, so now you ask a more basic political question. And this flows from everything we've talked to this point. And it gets around to that little tiny government that you want, right? The basic political question that people refuse to ask each other, because if they answered it, we would have to act on it. But the basic political question is, how much do we owe each other? Right? What is that standard cost for living in civil society? And even the most ardent minarchists of us would say, of course there is one. Because the minute you put up a border and staff it with one border guard, you have a common cost. Okay, if you don't like borders, the minute you build a post office, you have a common cost, right? The minute you have a courthouse, you have a common cost. So there's a batch of things. that bring with them common costs. And we could argue about how big those common costs should be, but that they exist is beyond question, right? And this flows directly from Aristotle, literally thousands of years ago, who said that man is a social animal. And if man is a social animal, then we live together. And if we live together, then certain costs emerge. And if certain costs emerge, well, taking it that one half step further, then we're on the hook for those collectively. And then we have to figure out how best to deal with that. But
this means this is what we lack, and if in our society that we're recreating, we need a vision. Like,
well, that's right.
What are we? Right.
The real question here is, how much do we owe each other? Not whether we do or not. And Ant and I will submit that it's not 100%, and we've already determined it's not 0%. Those answers are ridiculous, patently absurd. So then we back off a little bit. Is it 95 or 5? Yeah, probably not. Probably, but notice the language. Now it's only probably not.
Let me ask you something. The throw a fly in the ointment here, guys, is I'm going to be an anarchist. No man is fit to serve. I am not going to pay taxes. I'm not participating. I'm going to hang out in the Adirondack Mountains. Leave me alone. How does our government hang out with that guy?
The one that we're proposing or the one that we now have?
No, the one we're proposing.
Yeah.
I would want to leave that guy alone.
And now I'm not so sure. I think ultimately, if you're not going to avail yourself of any of the resources of civil society, yeah, maybe there are zones you can go live in. If you want to go live in the mountains, fine. I mean, there's going to be all kinds of property right issues that come with that line of reasoning, right? Because that guy is going to say, I have the right to this property. Well, who has prior claim? I'm not sure. But conceptually, I guess I'm willing to consider that, as long as we're also willing to say, look, you can never come back because we're all paying as we go. And you can't opt out for 30 years and then have a change of heart because we've been going all along, right? We've all incurred the common cost and you haven't. And, you know,
yeah,
go ahead.
I'm much more sympathetic to the anarchist view. I agree with James that there's this question of, well, if you want to opt out, where are you going to go? The way we have divided the planet thus far, every piece of space, with the exception of Antarctica, belongs to some country. So you'd need some decent sized space that all the countries say, okay, we're going to leave this alone. Nobody lay claim to it. It's for the anarchists. I disagree with James with the idea that once you decide to leave, that's it, you're out. I think a reasonable people would recognize that, particularly as they're young, there are going to be people who want to go do this anarchist thing, and then they realize, well, wait a minute, actually, I'd rather owe my neighbor something in exchange for having a neighbor, who owes me something, and so they're going to come back.
Yeah, I would say that I get that, but I think you're probably subject to immigration law on your way back in. Once you've left,
sure.
Then whatever the community puts up as a rule for entry for foreigners probably applies to you.
That makes sense. And I have not been enjoying paved roads and internet and everything else while I've been in the Adirondacks. So why can't I just come back and then I've got to deal with the immigration laws and then,
because we've all been paying even if we don't enjoy certain things, right? If you don't have children, you're still paying property taxes and paying for other people's children to go to school.
Well, we got to talk about separating too. There's the national version, right? Which I think is important to, of course, Madison talked about a greater republic, in a series of smaller republics, right? And so does the national government is really national defense? Like let's name those things which our national government would be in charge of. Immigration, because it's a national, I'm a citizen of the nation, or am I a citizen of the state? Well, we still have got to have some laws so people don't dump into California and then they just dump into Nevada from there. That doesn't make much sense. So like what stuff would our national government do? And where could I go if I wanted statewide healthcare, or if I wanted excellent roads versus crappier roads versus public education versus leave me the hell alone? And it seems like in those places you could have anarchists hanging out in New Hampshire if for the most part they were just like, look, I will not pay property tax. I will not pay income tax, but I recognize that when I go get my food and beer or whatever else, I'm going to have to pay out the nose, or there's going to be a way to exact a cost for enjoying the this police.
Yeah,
Or whatever.
I think there would be. To simplify the example, suppose we had some space that was not subject to any national government, and the anarchists all went out there. I think the first thing that would happen is they would develop market solutions for things like the roads and the mail and so forth. And I think long term, what would happen is they'd form their own government. Because the interesting thing, if you take spontaneous order seriously, governments always emerge. They're a result of spontaneous order. So I would find it hard to believe that long term a bunch of people would not evolve their own government.
So here, when the anarchists decide to send hate mail, send it to Ant.
There you go.
Because it was Anthony who just determined that anarchists would, as a matter of nature, devise their own governments.
I think that's true. I also think there's two things I think with anarchists. And again, I have respect for a bunch of the guys that I've listened to talk about this, but there's two things I can't get over. One is I agree. I think at some point they would say, look, we happen to be the smart guys who brought everybody else here and helped them see the virtue. We got to maintain this order somehow so that Charlie doesn't think that he can, his bullet that just hit the pig over the next lot, he can just get away with that. He owes it. Like, well, who's going to exact? How does that work? Oh, contractual arrangements. That's not going to go down. The other thing is the use of force. When we privatize force, don't even get me going for a minute that, Halliburton of New Hampshire is not going to, come up against, Raytheon of Vermont at some point and be like, hey, wait a second here. These guys, and there's going to be, maybe they just get together. Oh, now look who's in charge. Wait a second. So I think at some level you are going to have a monopoly on, well, that's not true either. I think God bless the Second Amendment, though we might say it loosely a lowercase m monopoly that the national government has the most possible use of force and violence towards its citizens. It would not really be good if they came outwardly against Americans because we're so very well armed and it wouldn't work out. So that's a good little check, right? Ambitions, James?
Yeah, no, that's right. And that's typically how I see the Second Amendment.
All right.
But going back to the same point, we've already shown that Aristotle would have yielded certain answers to these questions, right? But we can jump that all the way to America. Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence said, look, government exists to secure your rights. And if it doesn't do that, you can alter or abolish it and replace it with one that you think will. What was not an option to Jefferson? Not having one. Right? So you have Aristotle and Jefferson to contend with here if you're going to say, look, we don't need government. Yeah, I think we do. And when Ant refers to it as an emergent phenomenon, I think that's exactly the way of looking at it, right? Because it does just simply emerge from human interactions.
I think there's a workable hybrid here between these two extremes of omnipresent government and anarchy. And that is a term that our friends on the left use a lot, and I don't think they appreciate how powerful it is. And that's subsidiarity, which is, in short, governing at the lowest possible level. So if there's something that the local government can handle, the state should not. If there's something the state can handle, the federal government should not. You govern at the lowest possible level. And if you imagine governing like that, what happens is basically the federal government becomes, the national defense, and that's it. Everything else can be handled lower. Now, what do you gain by this? What you gain is the ability to bring market forces to bear on government itself. That is, you have a locality that's governing in a certain way. Pittsburgh, for example, and Cleveland governs in a different way, and actually Cleveland gets better results. At least for me, it gets better results. So I moved to Cleveland, and other people do that as well. And what happens is Cleveland's tax base now increases while Pittsburgh's diminishes. And so Pittsburgh has to do the same thing that a competing business has to do when it loses customers, is to sit back and say, what are we doing wrong? What can we do better? Who's doing better than us, and what are they doing? And you create competition amongst the local governments that is as powerful as competition is amongst businesses. But what we do in this country is the exact opposite. We understand economically that monopolies are bad. but we turn around and embrace political monopoly. That's what federal governing is.
And what Ant talks about here is not a hypothetical academic thing. He and I are starting today to write on a phenomenon that's emerging in the various high tax states right now. And we'll just use California as an example because I've got the numbers off the top of my head. From 2006 to 2016, California has lost 1 million of its population. And then you ask, why? Well, it's because it's an incredibly high tax state. And the taxes are more than simply looking at the income tax levels, right? It filters in all kinds of ways, yielding a cost of living that's disproportionately high compared to the other states of the union. And this manifests most obviously in housing prices. In California, housing costs are roughly double the average state in the United States. And people are able to consider that, right? Because you want to move to California or you already live there and you need a bigger house. But guess what? You can't afford one. So what do? You start looking around at the neighboring states, where I am in Utah, up in Wyoming, Colorado, Arizona. All of these states are experiencing a boost in population from the California outflow, right? It's because they've lost 1 million over the last 10 years. And then just recently they announced that starting in 2020, every new home construction will, by law, require solar panels to come with it. Well, that's going to drive the price of housing up further, and it will send more people packing to places that don't charge these sorts of things, and you don't have to pay an arm and a leg for a home. Well, what's happening here? Who's leaving? The people who are leaving are people who are in a financial condition in which they are able to leave. So pretty well-heeled folks are packing up stakes and moving. Who's not leaving? People who can't afford it, and people who are, generally speaking, net takers in the welfare state that is California. So net payers are leaving, net takers are staying, which will cause the tax base to shift. Right, they won't be able to raise as much money by taxes. And the politicians will then look to who? The middle class, because those are the only people who are left. So middle class taxes will go up, which will push down the level of people who it makes sense for financially to leave the state. And all of a sudden, you see an exodus that will start to gain in steam over time as more people with money leave and as more people without it stay. Or even come in. So it's more than just the 1 million who have left. It's what's the overall net reaction of the population to these policies. And other states, like Utah right now, gets a good number of California refugees. Right? Well, of course they do. It's a relatively low tax state. Housing values are actually quite rational. So it makes perfect sense for somebody to move here from there. And we're seeing this in New Jersey, and we're seeing it in New York, and we're seeing it in Connecticut, right? All the high-tax states. So we see this playing out right before our eyes. It just so happens that as this process is gaining steam, the numbers are actually relatively small, relatively so.
Right, but we're going someplace.
But yeah, we are very likely going someplace, because if people take nothing away from what Ant and I say, you should take this away. Incentives matter. And when people face incentives, they will react in the way that they will react.
I love it. And I always talk about it at the state, like, California can have Californian healthcare, 100% covered. Everybody here is covered. And then the rest of us in the country can just laugh at them as they go in the gutter. Or if they figure something out that we didn't know, well, we can do something with that. But I even like it, the idea of even at a lower level. There's by the way, as we're talking, I'm realizing this is less of how do we put together the country, the three of us, and realizing I actually just want your help to help me create the country I want. So just so we're all clear.
That's great. We'll do that, and then we'll have to kill you.
That's right. Well, you had a benevolent dictator, and then that's how. I better be very clear how we structure this.
Remember, incentives matter.
No, I know. I'll be good to you guys. I'll pay you. I'll tax Ant to give to you. You look bigger. I've never seen you guys in person. Let's see. So I've got two concerns. One is tax. I want to not. I know, if I'm not mistaken, wasn't in the Constitution. I think Ant, you and I talked about the apportionment tax that wasn't it at one point the notion was the national government could tax, but it wasn't going to directly tax. It was going to tax the states, and the states could come up with that money how much ever they wanted based on the budget in the 13 or 22 or how many ever states we had, right?
James, that's your area.
No, it's not. I don't study tax.
Oh,
All right. So I will say I thought that
apportionment.
Either way, let's
I
toss
don't
it.
know the answer to that.
So let's just throw out there, recognizing that that would be an option that the federal government could, in its limited way, right? We're going to get rid of most of the amendments and most of the regulatory commit. Get it out of here. All right, good. We've got it down to about a fifth its size, as Walter Williams says, and about a fifth of its cost. Amen. We're already happy. We got to do some more fine, nuanced work, but we're good. Excuse me. All right, guys, we need to come up with. I don't even know. What's our current annual budget in our nation?
About 3.8 trillion.
All right, we need $800 million, Ant. Hopefully my math is pretty good.
Careful, because if we're going to do this seriously, I'm going to tell you that I think a direct tax on the people is absolutely best. And let's take a backward step.
That's what I was going to ask you. Okay, let me frame the question, and then you go at it. Let me frame the question. So the question is, we're going to have to tax the national level for the post office, and we're going to have some interstate. I got it. And we're going to have national defense and maybe one or two other things. But basically, this is all we're doing. And the executive branch isn't doing all sorts of funky things. No, you're deciding what color pencils you use, and you're enforcing the laws. Right? You've got your constitutional authority and nothing beyond. Great. We've now got to come up with $800 billion amongst 50 states, or 330 million people. James, give me why you think we said just a direct flat tax is a good idea.
Because that's the only way we can answer the most important political question. How much do we owe each other? Because once you answer that question, now it's a percentage, right? What percentage of what you earn do we owe each other? Only after answering that question can you write a check for that much. Because that's what you have to do. If we're going to deal with a just system, then first I want to know what we all owe each other. Then I want everybody to write a check.
So regardless whether I make $50 million a year or $1,500 a year, it's 10%. It's just, or 7% or 3%, whatever it is. And that is what I owe. And that I've rocked it and made a ton of money and made great decisions financially about. I'm going to pay that, and it's fine. I'm not getting killed, or I'm not finding 17 loopholes to avoid paying anything.
Yeah.
And the guy who's making $1,500, well, we'll give him $15,000 a year. He's in tough shape. He still maintains his dignity in putting into the system, but it's a much smaller amount.
Well, correct. And I think, and here's why I was not jumping on board with a purely flat tax system. Ant and I, we talked about this a lot. And most people who are in favor of a flat tax aren't actually in favor of a flat tax. They're in favor of a graduated income tax with one gradation. Because we always end up talking about a personal exemption. How much of what you make should just be yours, up to but no further, right? And whatever we decide so I think politically we have two questions that must be answered. How much do you owe each other in terms of a percentage of what you make, and how much of what you make should be off limits to everyone? Understanding that there's a certain amount that you'll have to make just to get by. So
I make 100,000. Say Ron makes 100,000 a year. As an example, you would say we're not touching 15 grand, like automatically off. It's just not happening.
Right. Or whatever the number we decide collectively is. Maybe it's 50, maybe it's 35. Look, I don't know, but that's a discussion we have to have collectively. That's not something that can be imposed from without. Our betters in Washington, D.C. can't say this is what justice is. We have to decide what justice is in this respect. So what you get to keep is a collective determination, somewhere between 0 and X dollars. What we owe each other, that's also a collective determination, somewhere between 0 and X%. And those are the two questions you have to answer. Once they've been answered, it's very easy to determine a budget, because we can tell you with near certainty about how much you'll take in next year. And now all you have to do is multiply it by these numbers and figure out how much you'll actually get.
Now, what about the guy? I'm not talking about the high school kid who made $12,000 flipping burgers all last year. I'm talking about, or this crazy stuff where people expect, like, you can't make a living at Walmart. Well, you're not supposed to make unless you're a manager or, something, you're not supposed to be a cashier and like you're providing for a family of four. It's just not typical, but like it is in this system, which is intriguing to me. What is my fear is then that, oh, I made $22,000. I'm exempt because it's the first 30,000. It's like, oh no, because then some people are paying for others to enjoy the police department. And well, I guess I'm talking local and not the national, but.
Yeah, but you have to understand that some people will always pay for others. That's in the nature of taxation. We have to understand first, not these things, but what we think justice is, because that's the political question. First, you determine what justice is. Then you design a system to facilitate it. You don't do it the other way around. You don't do a bunch of stuff and then say, okay, is this just? If not, let's fix it. You have to have a very clear understanding of what you're trying to accomplish. And if the first thing is what we owe each other, well, then make it the first thing. And don't make it so for a bunch of people it's 0%, for another bunch of people it's 8%, and for another bunch it's 18%, all the way up to 98%. No.
And notice there's something subtle here, but very important. The way we go about doing the budget now is politicians ask, what do you want? And everybody puts their hands up when we want this, that, and the other thing. So they go and build it and then turn around and give us the bill. Rather than, according to James' model, it's the same model that a household uses, which is it says, okay, I've got this much money. Now, what can I afford to do with it?
What are our priorities?
Yeah, what do I want,
What needs to be at the top of this list? What's at the bottom in a wish list? What must happen? What's just superfluous? But if we decide, and I think a reasonable number that we might decide would be 18%, right? If we decide that we owe each other 18% of our incomes, well, take GDP, multiply it by 18%. That's how much you're going to get. Now figure out what everything you want to accomplish is going to cost, rank order them, and cut a line right where you can't afford it anymore. Right. Look how easy a budget just became.
Right. Okay. I had a question and I lost it. There's a bunch of questions I have here. The notion of, I'm going to go back to what you said, about, even a group of anarchists at some point are going to create some form of union. And I do believe that to be what would happen. The metaphor that's often comes along with this conversation with an anarchist is, and I can go with this, is, hey, look, two people on a planet inhabited by two people, or an island inhabited by two people. I can't make you get a permit, James, to, become a coconut harvester. It's like, that's just ridiculous. You go freaking harvest some coconuts and whatever. And so, of course, there are great abuses of government, right? Because if you extrapolate that out, okay, we have 50 people. Well, who's a permitted coconut husker? Well, I'm more ambitious. I'm the guy that get up at 3 a.m. and I'm doing it before anybody else gets there. So you get the I get concerned when we start saying I just would want extraordinary limitations of government so that it's not like, well, it's 18%. It's that simple. And then we're just done and we're happy because, well, okay, but this was on the wish list and this has been on the wish list a long time. Isn't it time that it's like, okay, what's the limitation so that we don't recognize I believe we're already stepping over a natural right principle, which is I own myself and I own my labor and I own the fruits of that labor. I'm willing to be here and be part of this community under these terms, but beyond it, there's a place where slavery starts happening. And we know that how do you boil a frog? You turn up the water slow, slow, slow. And I think that's happening in America. There's rights all over the place and bills and taxes all over the place. And it's not, if troops marched from Washington or forts all over America armed and we're going to go get New Orleans and Albany and Sacramento, people would go out and meet them with guns. But it's drip, drip, drip. And here we are getting our hands bound right in front of our eyes and we don't see it. I don't want to create that same thing. How do we bind people down, a government down? And
there's no perfect answer, but a reasonable answer is that you encode the taxation in the Constitution, but you leave the spending to be handled by the legislature.
Yeah, no, and Ron, one of the difficulties you're going to come up against here is that you're groping for some sort of contractual answer, and you're groping for a contractual context. But if Aristotle's right, government is more like an organism, and a contract is never really going to apply. It's an emergent phenomena that just grows and adapts and evolves over time. And if the only way, I think, to address that sort of thing along with the concerns you have are by creating some sort of context, some Bill of Rights, say, or some such thing that indicates that these are the things no government can do, period. And then leaving that off to the side, or trying what the American founders tried earlier on by saying, look, the Constitution is one of enumerated powers, so it literally can't do anything else if it's not in this list. And then, radically defang a Supreme Court constitutionally, so they can't do the mental gymnastics and cartwheels that typically come when governments decide in their own favor to become more powerful over time, right?
I would wait. You said something that was really good, and I don't know if you didn't complete the thought or if it's just such an assumption on your part, but I want to articulate it, and I think you meant to say some version of this, but I think there needs to be like an exhaust, like what are those pressure cooker, like where there's a way that I can escape if I realize, look, James and Ant just raised it to 27%. This is outrageous. I actually don't want to take part in this anymore, and I recognize we're going to have Anthony's island that we're all going to leave Ron alone on. But I would want to know that people could say, I'm not participating in this anymore. This is ridiculous. I work 1 out of 4 days to pay for, because we know who goes into government at some point.
Right. And this is another one of those things where it's not going to be perfect or pointless. It's going to be better or worse. And the better answer here is having a public discussion year in, year out, where we decide collectively what the percentage is going to be, because that will put a natural downward pressure on it, right? There's a natural upward pressure whenever politicians spend money. The pressure will always be, let's spend more, we'll put the funding off into a future time. But when people have to answer, what percent of your income next year are you not going to get? There will be a natural downward pressure on the system. And that's the obvious check. People's self-interest is the obvious check. Will it creep up from time to time? Yeah, I suspect it would. Would it creep down from time to time against all human experience with government? I suspect that would be the case too. But I also suspect, to my core, that it would hover around some sort of equilibrium point that we all kind of understand to be reasonable. And Ant has uncovered some very interesting things about what human beings think is reasonable as opposed to what we now do. So maybe, Ant, you want to throw these numbers out there.
You're talking about the 18%, James?
Well, more or less, yeah.
Yeah. So this is, economists have a name for it, and I've forgotten what it is now. But if you look historically, the federal revenues, so add up all sources of federal government revenue combined, taxes, tariffs, fees, whatever it is, add it all up, it ends up being about 18% of GDP. And it's 18% of GDP pretty much regardless of whether we tax the rich, whether we tax the poor, whether we tax capital gains, whether we tax estates, whether we tax high, whether we tax low. You can do whatever you want to the tax code, and going back 40 years or more, it's this constant 18% of GDP. And you see the same phenomenon in states. My home state of Pennsylvania, for example, the number's about 5%. It doesn't matter whether we're taxing incomes more or less, or property more or less, or whatever it is. The state, the local governments together take in about 5% of the state GDP. So if that's the case, if that's the answer, that regardless of what you do in this society, that's what the government's getting, then let's just simplify it and say, all right, to the federal government, you pay 18% of your income, period. To the state government, you pay 5%, and you're done.
And then you end up with a condition of 23%, which is right in the ballpark whenever you ask a large group of people what they think they owe each other. Now, what does this not take into account? Deficit spending. Right? It only accounts for the money that gets taken in. It doesn't account for money that gets spent without being taken in. So really, ballparking everything in a very simplistic sort of way, roughly 23% of all incomes should be collected in taxes, and whatever that number is, that's about what government at all levels can hope to spend without having a problem. And if you made that deal with the American people right now, if you said, hey, tell you what, we'll only charge you 23%, that'll cover your federal and state taxes, and then we'll never spend more than that. If you just left the argument there at that rational point of inception, almost everybody, a vast majority of the American people would look at that and say, that's reasonable.
Right.
And they may say, I would prefer if it were 20, or I wouldn't mind if it were 27. But when you say 23%, everybody starts to nod a little bit, because that's not fabulously unreasonable. There's nothing crazy about it.
I can notice what you don't get with this. What you don't get is one segment of the population voting for more taxes, while another portion of the population wants less taxes, because everybody's got to pay whatever the number is, the 18 to 23%. And so it hits the poor and the rich proportionally in the same way. When you have a progressive tax, you've got the poor saying, yes, absolutely, increase the taxes, because it's not going to be falling on them. It's going to be falling on somebody else.
And not only that, Ant, it's not falling on the poor, but it's also not falling on the working class, and it's not falling on most of the middle class.
Yeah, under our current system, it's only about 40% of Americans who are net payers to the federal government. 60% are net recipients.
That doesn't mean that these people aren't filling out their tax forms, and it doesn't mean that withholding isn't taken from their checks. They think they're net payers. But in point of fact, when you balance the amount that they pay versus the amount that they receive in terms of government benefits, the benefits eclipse what they pay in. So only about 40% of the American people actually are net payers.
Okay, so now what's a benefit?
Start saying things like, we need to tax the rich. We're already only taxing the rich.
Well, so we're taxing others, but the middle class or upper middle class, poor, they're getting so much more in benefits relative to the upper class.
Now, be careful. When we say benefits here, James used the word benefits. It's technically, we call it transfers.
Transfer payments.
Transfer payments. This is not, don't picture roads and bridges and schools. That's not it. It's literally money the federal government hands back to people. So some of it comes in the form of the earned income tax credit, which actually, depending on your income level, can actually cause you to receive money back from the government that you never paid in. Some of it comes in unemployment benefits. Some of it comes in Social Security benefits. So it's various instances in which the federal government is quite literally cutting you a check. It's a negative tax.
Wow. Well, that's not me.
But it is 60% of the American people.
Okay, so here are a couple lines in the sand for me is I don't want to pay property tax, because if I have to pay property tax, I never actually own my property. Because it's like, I'm not, that just flies right in the face of, I don't actually even own my house, and you can kick me out of my house. Why? Because I didn't pay for, that's frustrating. So I recognize we've addressed national and state, but we haven't addressed local. And maybe that's for the mayors and their legislative bodies. But I'd love to have simplicity at every single level. And of course, we're not going to get consensus. But one thing that I was really, I don't say excited about, but what I was happy about as I listened to you guys talking is the way to do this is not through a national education association, because as much as it might be great to force these principles into kids' mind of not nationals, but a patriotic understanding of limited government and your personal responsibility and your self-authority to be a living example of freedom, that would be great, except we know that that's going to get deteriorated over time anyway. And I thought, wow, here are these two guys. You guys travel all over the country. You teach, and whether it's in a high school or you do lectures, all over the place. You're actually doing what I think is the ideal, which is outside of the confines of any government, traveling around and teaching people individual liberty, personal responsibility, proper understanding of economics. And boy, maybe, I always have to hold on to some hope. I mean, otherwise you just give up. Right. But it's excellent that you guys are actually living examples of doing just that. Let's take a quick detour from our Reconstructing America. I know you guys were on a quick, an 8-day road trip recently. What can you give us any stories about some folks that you talked to and some encouraging moments as you were teaching?
Well, one of the things that we've noticed, and we literally travel the entire country doing this, talking to AP level juniors and seniors who are studying economics and government. And we have been to the second poorest county in the country. And we have been to some of the richest counties in the country. So abysmally poor schools and incredibly rich schools that make colleges look poor. And the interesting thing we found is that good students, good teachers seem not to be correlated with the money. You find, this poorest school we've been to have some of the best students we've encountered and some of the best teachers. And some of the very rich schools have less so. Some of them have excellent students, excellent teachers. So I think what we found is, when we talk in this country about having a public education problem and the answer is to spend more money, what we're observing is that the money isn't the issue. It's the teacher. It's to a large extent as well, I imagine, it's the student's parents. That's what matters. And so I've started to say recently that when it comes to teacher pay in this country, we do have a problem. It's not that teachers are paid too little, and it's not that they're paid too much. It's that they're paid uniformly. The principals don't have the ability to do what every other manager across the country can do, which is to give a premium to the high-performing workers and less of a pay to the low-performing workers.
Yeah, that's right. And what we found with teachers and students kind of dovetails with what we began with here when we talked about Madison saying, don't expect to find good people in government. Well, I mean, you would expect these things to be randomly distributed across the country. But of course you would, because that's how everything is distributed across the country. So when we happen upon a great teacher, what we find is that great students are there too, because great teachers are able to bring certain things out in the raw materials of students to turn them into great students. And when we find teachers who don't care, we similarly find students who don't really care. Well, stop the presses, right? Of course, that's what we find. But really, the second question, how to address that, that's the issue. And teachers always say, not surprisingly, we need to be paid more. And we've come to disagree quite strenuously with that. We think some teachers need to be paid more. And we think other teachers need to be paid much, much less. And the unions have gotten a hold of this, and they've kind of homogenized the pay structure, as unions often do.
Yep.
Length of service matters more than quality of service. And that's something that people are going to have to address, or they'll have to live with things the way they are.
Think of the incentive.
Those are the options.
If I can find a way to make you endure me for 20 years, I'll be at the highest pay rate and I'll have tenure, and you can't get rid of me. And I am destroying your kids' initiative and capacity. I was in a Twitter argument with people, some teachers who were talking about, yay, we got our money and we did this and we did that. I'm like, yeah, and you messed up kids who for 4 weeks or how many weeks weren't able to, but we did it for the kids as well. And I said, you didn't do it for the kids. You did it for yourself. Well, we also fought for better school, better computers. I said, stop. Unions are in business for, and correct me guys if I'm off at all, because this is what my stand was. I said, unions are in business to serve their customers. The customers are the teachers, not the students. You can rap like America does. They do all sorts of the Patriot Act. You call it whatever, euphemisms all over the place. They rap whatever they want in red, white, and blue. And we go, oh, it's patriotic. We should just, no. I said, you struck, and what you did was, now what? You were willing to do that for no matter how long it was. And what if I wasn't able to graduate? What if I'm one of those edge kids who wasn't, and I got back, well, they could take summer school. Okay, good. So I'm not going on vacation with my family. I can't work all summer to pay for college. I have to finish my class because you were getting your benefits for the sake of the kids. It's crap. And my argument again and again, let me just say this quick. My argument again and again was, what I want is excellent teachers to be paid astronomically, just whatever the market will bear. And I want idiot teachers to be kicked to the curb because they don't get the job done. Yeah. And there seems to be the parents are too stupid to know. They kept saying, it sounds like you don't know anything about education. I'm going, what are you talking about, know anything about education? So there seems to be like, oh, people in the inner city don't know what good education is. People in rural districts, they don't know, and therefore they need to be taught. But every parent wants his kid to be brilliant and excellent and superb, unless there's something truly wrong. So, James, you were going to say something.
Yeah, look, I don't fault teachers for pursuing their individual interest. Of course they should do that, right? Everyone does. That's not the defect in this system. The defect in this system is that second thing that you talked about a second ago, where parents like to think of this as the way they outsource this problem to people who know better, people who have been trained in a certain way, people who are expert in this sort of thing. And what they've ended up doing is buying a bill of goods with that thought, because just because teachers might be able to teach in a classroom and have the expertise to do that, they don't have the expertise to set up an incentive-based market to hire teachers in, right? Because now what they end up doing is substituting their own self-interest and saying, this is what we really need to pay attention to. So really, if parents would pay a lot more attention and say, look, this isn't how we want to do this, and think about all the steps this would have to go through, right? We've got local school boards, state politicians. There's a bulwark in place to protect these people now, as there is with any guild system. They turn around, they co-opt political power, they arrange it in such a way as to make themselves virtually unassailable. And until we start demanding different things from our teachers, we're not going to get different things from our teachers. And that's just how it goes.
And I think in our podcast that we did, you mentioned that some unions actually have their pay structured is pegged to a minimum wage.
Right. Yeah.
So of course they're driving for 15 because it's like, oh, I'm making 50,000. I'm going to be making 62. So pay those people what they're worth.
Yeah, just to be clear, we don't know of any teachers union that does this.
Okay, great.
This is a union tactic more broadly. But look, you always have to ask yourself, what is it that I want? What is my goal? And
well, I want excellent teachers, excellent education for my children.
If the goal is to have highly paid teachers, then that's what you're going to get. If the goal is to have excellent teachers, well, then that's what you're going to get. But you have to look at all the forces that are arrayed around an issue and start picking out the ones that work in this direction and the ones that work in this direction. Because if your goal is excellent teachers, well, then bad teachers are going to have to go. So any system that protects all teachers uniformly works against your goal. I mean, it's just that simple. And you have to be willing to admit what your goal is. And then the most important part, admit the difficult steps you will have to take to achieve your goal.
Right.
And that's usually where these things go off the rails.
Right. Yeah, that's the hard work.
There's a relatively easy, well, and I emphasize relative, a relatively easy way to take a big first step in this direction. And that's, you don't have to invoke charter schools. You don't have to invoke private schools. You can stick with the public school system as you have it. But let the parents choose whatever school they want for their kids. You're no longer confined geographically. And the same amount of money, whatever the tax dollars are, but it's the same for every student statewide. That amount of money follows that student.
And this would be a massive improvement, right, Ant? This is much better than what we have, but it's not perfect. And it won't yield perfect outcomes.
Here's the thing. We talk about quality education. The fact is, not only can you not define it, but I don't think the definition exists, because quality education is different for each person. You know, if I've got a kid who isn't that bright, but you know, maybe he's strong, he's vibrant, I want a school that will emphasize, you know, maybe sports, right? Or something he can do with his hands.
Right.
Right, exactly. If I've got, you know, some other student who's more of an introvert, a bookworm, I wanted school that emphasizes something else. And so what you do under a system like this is you let the parents look at the totality of the school, compare that totality to the kid, and say, this is a better fit, this is a worse fit, and the dollars follow.
And again, this isn't going to be perfect, right? Because in some rural areas, there will be but one school.
Right.
Yep.
So, you know, what are you going to do? But the reality is this would be a world better than what we have. But we tend not to think about better and worse. We tend to think about what we now have and perfect.
Well, and if we decentralize,
we tend not to do it.
Yeah, right. That it makes sense. And that you can see this in libertarian circles where, you know, we'll get in arguments over like nonsense. Even with anarchists, it's like, guys, let's at least get to like this, because you can't convince people there should be no government at all. It's all slavery. It's like, yeah, true. And like, let's just get people to realize maybe the basic, like,
yeah, can
basic
we address immigration first, please?
Yes.
Right.
But exactly. So, what strikes me too about even the rural school though, James, is if I'm I'm going to go to Indiana, we're at Salt Lick and there's one school, that's it. And I'm going to know these kids from kindergarten through high school, and there's 12 of us or whatever it is or was. What I would imagine is that there would have its own benefits. Like the market would say, oh, there's 12 parents who are going to follow Miss Johnson, who's in kindergarten. Everybody knows Miss Johnson's an alcoholic. She's abusive to the kids. Miss Johnson ain't going to last long unless there's a teachers union. They're just going to say, look, we voted, like none of the parents want her. We're sick of dealing with her. Miss Johnson, you got to go. So I would imagine even in that small situation, if you weren't dealing with teachers unions in Indiana or, some national union, you're still going to be okay, even because we've decentralized power, whether it's from the unions or a national or statewide authority.
The lesson here, I think, broadly speaking, is that you can't fix 100% of anything.
Right.
Right. But I think you can fix 75, 80% of almost everything with radically altered incentive structures. That if you just re-incentivize things, you're going to get about 80% of the way home. And given where we're beginning with most things we would call a problem, solving 80% of it is a brilliant first step, and we should absolutely do it. Right? That's what we should be doing. And politically, look, I'm not happy knowing that I'll never get 100% of anything that I know to be best. But if I could get 80% of things that I thought to be best, I would rarely complain about much.
Yeah.
Right.
And then we can actually,
most of us would fall into that very reasonable ground.
Yep.
So we started a little bit late. Can I keep you for another like 5-8 minutes?
I got 5 more.
Sure.
Okay, good. So I'm going to try to summarize where we are. So if I'm going to reconstruct, there needs to be a vision. Here's what it means to be an American. And I'm going to talk about things like hard work and diligence and family first and self-government, or as you've talked about, James, self-reliance, right? Okay, cool. So we start pointing out the virtues of this and that. This is what it means. And wow, there's something to rally behind rather than kneel for, right? It's actually something virtuous and good. Great. It seems like we need to get really clear about what happens at the national level and what cannot. Like let's name some things, general species of things that can't be touched, but recognize that these are not limited, like, just like the 9th and 10th Amendments. We're not covering it all, but what we mean is this. And if, I don't even know how to say what I'm saying, but basically if what is that? The 10th Amendment. If we forgot that, you can't do that either. Basically that. All right, good. States. I have a lot more mercy for California to turn into an absolute paradise of hell if it wants to. It's beautiful views of hell. Like it's great. We could overlook the beautiful Golden Gate Bridge as, slum cities are set up along its borders. Great. Okay. I would want the states to have way more freedom. I don't know about the power of secession. I don't know. What do you think? We didn't address that. What about the power of secession? If we're like
that can of worms for the next time we're here.
Let's just touch do I have as New York, if we're like, wait a second, you guys are losing your minds at the national level. We are New Yorkers. We're no longer part of America.
Well, I think in a properly functioning political unit, which includes subdivisions, the right of exit probably has to exist.
I think so. Just like our anarchist needs to be able to go to the Adirondacks if he needs to get away.
I think, if the people there collectively want to opt out, okay, I think we have to allow that, understanding that there are going to be real problems if and when that comes to pass.
And there must have been big problems to cause it to come to pass as well, right? That's something
right. But, what do we do with that minority in that political subdivision who didn't want to leave? And, look, there are going to be difficulties, but I think at least conceptually, contra Lincoln, you have to say, look, if you people decide you want to opt out of this, our knee-jerk reaction has to be, yes, okay.
It's almost like yeah, right. Well, it almost feels like in a divorce situation. If I'm, if James, you and I get married,
could happen, Ron.
It could happen. It's legal. Okay, so if somebody wants out, no, I'm going to bring a gun. I'm going to threaten to beat you up. I'm going to like that. That's not love. First of all, that's not.
What's the point gets to be the question.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you know what? In time, New York 17 years later may go, yeah, you guys have corrected yourselves. You've turned the boat around a little bit here. And we realize that we may have been jumped the gun a little bit here. Now we can talk about where we've separated. Do we get married again or do we come?
We have to ask the question, do we want them back?
That's a great question as well. I like that. All right, Anthony, James and I are yapping. Go ahead and hit us home with what do we left on the table? Divisions of power, basically, and also the right to. I love this. If we get nothing else out of this, by the way, but that we have the pressure cooker that can let steam out, and the anarchists can go to the Adirondacks, and New Yorkers can get the hell out. But Tag, brother, take us out of here.
Yeah, I have to reiterate. I'm really sympathetic to the anarchist view. I'd like little better than for it to be right. But and James used to beat on me for this all the time because I would spout my anarchist stuff until one day we're talking and I come to this emergent order thing and I realize, well, wait a minute, look historically, governments always emerge. And that tells me, as an economist, it tells me that there's something there that's of fundamental value that the anarchist position is overlooking. Now that's not to say that we should just throw up our hands and say, well, the anarchists just don't know what they're talking about. I think there's plenty of good lessons that anarchists can provide. And I think they come, again, along the lines of subsidiarity. That is, if you're gonna do government, do it at the lowest possible level, because then you allow, you create this competitive environment that makes our markets so vibrant.
Yeah, and to whatever degree I've prevailed upon Anthony to think of government as natural and emergent, he's also prevailed upon me to think about things like subsidiarity. And I think all of it works together to make a very rational, coherent, plausible whole, right? In a way that what we now have probably could be greatly improved.
Well, we're already getting rid of our 80%. Last little bit before we rock is I want to be able to instantiate it somehow so that, what you're saying, both of you guys, but Ant, you've spoken it literally twice now, I think, maybe 3 times in this subsidiary conversation, basically driving down government to the smallest element, which ultimately is me, and then it's me and my family, and then it's me and my, the various, my localities in the church maybe I would belong to or whatever. I would want very strong, beyond parchment, but some, maybe it goes back to what you were saying earlier, James, too, is the competing incentives. What was the word you were using?
Probably that.
Competing interest. That New York State doesn't suddenly decide, well, that's not a local matter really, because it's our best interest if everybody in New York, whoa, hold on. Ron, you're not really allowed to buy your kid this kind of helmet. It has to be this kind of helmet. What? Wait a second. My locality's decided that my kids don't have to wear their helmets. Or it can be, so I'm aware that there would have to be clearly articulated, whether they're constitutions or contracts. And I know, James, you've mentioned, Ron, you really want this. I do. I want some protections. And I know the only way really properly to articulate a right is to say what you can't do, which is basically aggress another. I would want my protections at every level clearly articulated in some fashion, and that is going to have to be a conversation for another day.
It's not going to happen. And the way I know it's not going to happen is because your rights are already clearly articulated in the Constitution, and we've spent the past 200 years wantonly violating them.
Right from the beginning, right?
Yeah, right from the beginning. Alien and Sedition Act, right from the beginning.
If there's an answer to what you're looking for, it doesn't lie with the government, it lies with the people. That is, if the people are of one mind and we agree, or at least most of us agree, yes, subsidiarity is important, checks and balances are important, personal rights are important, then you have the ultimate check on government, which is the people just won't stand for it.
Yeah, and the people ultimately always get about what they want. So we got where we are because the people got what they wanted.
Our baser instincts were
that's right.
fed. Yeah. Guys, this is really, I really enjoyed this, and we'll have to do this again sometime, and there's no shortage of conversations that can be had with the 3 of us. So thanks for being on. And Yeah, you're welcome. James didn't thank me.
Thank you.
There you go. So words and numbers, and you guys do this, is it weekly or bi-weekly?
Weekly.
Okay.
So we'll get you a link and people can look at it. And if there happen to be high school teachers out there who would like us to come visit your school, we'll get you a link and you can contact us and we will come and say hello.
Fantastic.
So until next time, Ron, have a good one.
Go watch James and Ant talk about the Pope and his lack of understanding.
We'll find something to irritate most people soon enough.
Thanks, guys.
See you later, Ron.
Thank you.
All right.